my dad sees this Corvette that's just like, dude, like Corvettes are, what you want to have. Like Corvettes are classics, and I wasn't really feeling it, and so I'm going through and I'm looking at other ones, and then this beautiful convertible black one pops up, and I show it to my dad. He's like, the paint is amazing on it. We got to go check this out, and we drive down there to Corona, check it out, and it was crazy how fast I fell in love with it for not knowing anything about the car, and almost immediately, I thought about it and was like, this is the car I want to have. And I pulled the trigger on it, and it's been one of the best decisions I've made, honestly. I think it's so raw because it's a V8 and it's loud, and it's it just screams just like as natural as it gets almost. And I don't know, just riding around in it with the top down and just like taking in nature and the environment and kind of just like living in the moment, like it really feels like I go back in time when I drive it. And that's kind of a refreshing experience. I just put my phone down and drive and just listen to music, and it's really refreshing, and it really calms the nerves, and just I'll pull it into the parking lot and I'll just sit there for a few hours just taking it all in, and it just really adds to the experience in that regard. Right now I'm kind of like I like a lot of lo-fi and like old school hip hop, and a lot of, it's called like glitch break. It's like, I don't know, kind of like drum and bass music. It varies, but mostly like the old school hip hop. So again, kind of like music that takes me back a little bit more, because I like the era. I just 80s 90s era. It seems like a cool time. Just like like I said, not having phones, and it's more so just like living in the moment. You don't you're not checking up on anything. You're not waiting for someone to text you back. It's just like let's go out and do this thing and let's enjoy it right now. And you meet people that way, and it's not so much like you, like I said, checking social media, like what's this person doing, and it's like ultimately it doesn't matter. It's just for a show. So I think that's what I really like about that era in specific. It was my neighbor at in the neighborhood I live in. When I first moved in, he lived a few houses down, and he was a grade above me, and his name was Connor, and he would come by every day to you know uh, come see if I could hang out and everything, and we hung out every day, and then eventually we went to the park, and I met that his friends that he knew in and I think we were in elementary school at the time, and they were all my grade, which was nice, and I had this cool little go kart, and they wanted to ride the go kart, which is at first kind of why they wanted to hang out a lot, because they wanted to ride the go kart, but yeah, slowly but surely, just from them all being in the neighborhood and getting to know them, they became my best friend group, and I thank Connor for that all the time. Unfortunately, Connor passed away from cancer a few years ago, and it was really sad. And despite me not really keeping in touch with him as often as I wish I did in the later years, yeah, I still think back to him as the reason I met the friends I had today. For the past 10 years, I had a strong group of friends that been lucky enough to have no issues with, no problems, and they're all amazing. And but recently, we're all transferred. A lot of them went to San Diego. One of them went to Berkeley. So they're kind of gone now. So I've kind of been forced to rely on that texting and calling, and keeping up like that. While texting and calling is great and everything, I just think like the snap decision of being able to do that is maybe not as fulfilling as actually going out there and hanging out with people. And every time I hang out with my friends, I feel just way happier than like I'm just texting them or calling them. That's kind of the correlation to the car, because again, those times of just living in the moment and just feeling that type of energy with the people around you, I think the car replicates that very well when I go on drives and things like that. Drives with other people, drives with myself. It replicates that well, and that's why I think the two kind of coexist well with one another, because they both are similar in that regards to how living in the moment and not really checking phones when hanging out with friends and things like that can be relieving. It's the same with driving a car from the 90s. The car doesn't have a touch screen, or it doesn't have a CD player. It had a cassette thing in it, so it's obviously it's meant for the old days. And so I think that's cool that it has less distractions on it, and it's just like focus on the road and just drive. which is nice.